Welcome back to Revenge Room. If you're new here, this is the place where we share real stories of betrayal, heartbreak, and the sweet taste of justice. Make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. Today's story is called "My Son Clapped in Approval While His Wife Screamed and Shoved Me Out. No One Wants You Here." They say blood is thicker than water, but what happens when your own son stands there watching his wife shove you toward the door, screaming that no one wants you anymore, and instead of defending you, he starts clapping? Not slow, sarcastic applause, real applause, the kind that says, "Finally she's doing what I never had the courage to do." I didn't fight back. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I simply walked to my room, packed a small bag with a few photographs of my late wife, and left the house I had lived in for over 40 years. They thought they had won. They thought I was just a broken old man with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. They thought wrong. Because what they didn't know was that my wife had seen this coming years before she passed. She left me something, a letter, a plan, and evidence that would turn their entire world upside down. This morning, my phone exploded with 99 missed calls. My son was screaming into my voicemail, begging me to answer. His wife was crying so hard she could barely speak, but there was no apology. Only panic. If you skip ahead or leave now, you will miss the most jaw-dropping twist I have ever shared on this channel. Stay until the very end, because what happens next proves that sometimes the quietest revenge is the one nobody sees coming. My name is Franklin Ward. I'm 69 years old, a retired postal worker who spent 38 years delivering letters to every doorstep in our small Pennsylvania town. I have lived in the same house for over 4 decades, the house where my wife Margaret and I raised our only son, the house where she took her last breath 2 years ago while holding my hand and whispering words I would not fully understand until much later. The living room still smelled like the lavender candles Margaret used to love when Lydia's voice cut through the evening silence like a blade. I had been sitting in my chair by the window, the same chair I had occupied every evening for 40 years, when she stormed in from the kitchen with a fury I had seen building for months, but never expected to erupt so violently. Her face was twisted into something unrecognizable, her eyes burning with a contempt she no longer bothered to hide. Evan stood behind her in the doorway, his arms crossed, his expression blank as a closed door. "You are a burden," Lydia screamed, her finger jabbing toward my chest like a weapon. "Do you understand that? A burden? You sit in that chair all day, you eat our food, you use our electricity, and you contribute nothing. Nothing. You are useless, Franklin. Completely and utterly useless." I looked past her to my son, waiting for him to speak, waiting for him to say something, anything, to defend the man who had raised him, who had worked double shifts to pay for his college, who had held him through every nightmare and celebrated every small victory of his childhood. But Evan said nothing. His lips pressed together in a thin line, and his eyes refused to meet mine. Lydia grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the front door with a strength fueled by years of resentment finally unleashed. "No one wants you here," she spat. "Do you hear me? No one. Get out. Get out of this house." And then I heard it, a sound that would echo in my memory for the rest of my life, a slow, deliberate clapping coming from the doorway where my son stood. I turned to look at him, my heart refusing to believe what my ears were telling me. But there he was, Evan, my boy, my only child, clapping his hands together in steady rhythm, applauding his wife's performance as if she had just delivered a speech worthy of a standing ovation. That was the moment something inside me quietly closed, not with a dramatic snap, not with rage or tears, but with the soft click of a door that had been waiting to shut for a very long time. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice or demand an explanation. I simply walked to the small bedroom that had been mine since Margaret passed and began to gather the only things that mattered. Her reading glasses still sitting on the nightstand where she had left them. A small photo album filled with pictures from our wedding day and the early years of our marriage. Her favorite gray cardigan that still carried the faint scent of her perfume. I folded each item carefully and placed them in a worn leather bag. When I returned to the living room, Lydia was standing by the open front door with her arms crossed, impatient and triumphant. Evan had stopped clapping but remained frozen in place, watching me with an expression I could not read. Perhaps guilt, perhaps relief, perhaps nothing at all. As I walked past them toward the door, I remembered something Margaret had told me 3 years before she died. We had been sitting on the back porch watching the sunset when she said almost casually, "Watch how Lydia looks at our home, Franklin. That is not love. That is calculation. Promise me you will be careful." I had dismissed her words, then unwilling to believe that the woman our son had married could be anything other than what she pretended to be. But Margaret had always seen people more clearly than I did. She had always known. She had also left me something, a drawer in her old desk that she told me to open only when I truly needed to. "You will know when the time comes," she had said. I never understood what she meant. Until now. I stepped through the doorway and into the cool evening air without looking back. Behind me I heard Lydia's satisfied sigh and the sound of the door slamming shut. They believed they had won. They believed they had finally removed the obstacle standing between them and whatever it was they truly wanted. They thought I was thrown out. They never knew I had already let go. The walk to Rosemary's house took only 7 minutes, but my mind traveled back through years of memories with every step. The evening air was cool against my face, and the familiar streets of our neighborhood passed by in a blur of streetlights and shadows. I had walked these sidewalks thousands of times during my years as a postal carrier, but tonight they felt different. Tonight, I was not delivering letters. I was carrying the weight of everything I had refused to see for far too long. Margaret had tried to warn me. In her final months, when the cancer had already begun to steal her strength, but not her clarity, she would often watch Lydia with an expression I could never quite decipher. One afternoon, just 3 weeks before she passed, Margaret had called me to sit beside her bed. Her voice was weak, but her eyes were sharp as ever. "Franklin," she said, gripping my hand with surprising force. "Don't trust Lydia's silence. It is not respect. It is calculation. She is waiting for something. I do not know what, but I can feel it. Promise me you will remember that." I had nodded and kissed her forehead, assuming the medication was making her paranoid. I told myself that Margaret was simply protective, that mothers never fully accept the women their sons choose. I was wrong. Margaret was not being paranoid. She was being observant in ways I had been too blind to see. The signs had been there for years, small cruelties that I had dismissed as misunderstandings or oversights. I remembered the Christmas 5 years ago when Lydia insisted on hiring a professional photographer for a family portrait. She had arranged everyone in the living room with meticulous care, positioning Evan in the center, with herself beside him, adjusting the children's outfits, directing every detail. When I moved to join the group, she looked at me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes and said, "Actually, Franklin, why don't you take a seat over there? We want this to be a nice shot of the immediate family." I sat in my chair by the window and watched them pose together, my son and his wife and their children, while I remained outside the frame like a piece of furniture that didn't match the decor. There were the dinners where my place at the table was mysteriously forgotten. Lydia would set out plates for everyone else, and when I arrived in the dining room she would feign surprise. "Oh, I must have miscounted," she would say, though her eyes held no apology. "Evan, can you grab another plate for your father?" It happened so often that I eventually started checking the table before meals, quietly adding my own setting before anyone noticed. I told myself it was easier that way. I told myself it did not matter. And then there were the conversations where I became invisible, even while sitting in the same room. Lydia would speak to Evan about me as if I were not there, discussing my habits, my health, my presence in the house, with the detached tone of someone inventorying an inconvenience. "Your father left the television on again last night," she would say, her eyes fixed on Evan while I sat 3 feet away. "Your father used the last of the coffee and didn't replace it." Never addressing me directly, never acknowledging that I could hear every word. It was a kind of erasure, slow and deliberate, designed to make me feel like a ghost in my own home. Whenever I tried to raise these concerns with Evan, his responses followed the same predictable pattern. "That's just how Lydia is, Dad. She doesn't mean anything by it." Or worse, "You're being too sensitive. She's under a lot of stress with the kids." He would pat my shoulder and change the subject, leaving me to wonder if perhaps I really was imagining things. Perhaps I really was too old, too set in my ways, too difficult to live with. Evan's dismissals were gentle but effective, and over time I learned to stop bringing up my grievances. I learned to swallow my discomfort and call it peace. Margaret saw through all of it. Even as her body weakened, her mind remained fierce and protective. A week before she died, she asked me to bring her the address book from her desk. She flipped through the pages with trembling fingers until she found what she was looking for. "Judith Keller," she said, pointing to a name and phone number written in her careful handwriting. "She's an old friend of mine, a lawyer. If you ever need help, Franklin, if you ever find yourself in trouble after I'm gone, call her. She will know what to do." I asked her what kind of trouble she was expecting, but Margaret just smiled that sad, knowing smile and said, "I hope you never need her. But if you do, she will be there." I did not understand then why my dying wife was giving me a lawyer's phone number. I thought perhaps she was worried about the will or the house or some legal matter I would need to handle after her passing. It never occurred to me that Margaret was preparing me for a battle she knew was coming, a battle she would not be alive to fight beside me. For years I had chosen silence over confrontation. I had bitten my tongue when Lydia insulted me, looked away when Evan failed to defend me, convinced myself that endurance was the highest form of love. I believed that keeping the family together was worth any personal cost, that my discomfort was a small price to pay for harmony. But walking through those quiet streets with Margaret's cardigan pressed against my chest, I finally understood the truth she had been trying to tell me. Silence, I believed, was the price of keeping a family. Margaret knew it was the cost of losing myself. The memory of that realization stayed with me as I continued walking toward Rosemary's house, but my thoughts kept drifting back to a night 3 months earlier when everything I believed about my situation began to shift. It was a night that changed how I saw Lydia, how I saw my son, and ultimately how I saw myself. Until that night, I had convinced myself that Lydia was simply a difficult person, someone whose sharp edges I needed to navigate carefully. After that night, I understood she was something far more dangerous. It was a Tuesday in late autumn, and I could not sleep. The house was quiet, except for the familiar creaks and groans of old wood settling in the cold. I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling for what felt like hours, my mind restless with thoughts I could not name. Finally, around 2 in the morning, I decided to go downstairs for a glass of water. I moved slowly, the way old men do when they are trying not to wake anyone, my bare feet careful on the wooden stairs. The kitchen light was off, but as I reached the bottom of the staircase, I noticed a faint glow coming from around the corner. Someone was awake. I heard Lydia's voice before I saw her, low and hushed in that particular tone people use when they do not want to be overheard. My first instinct was to turn around and go back to bed to respect her privacy and avoid any confrontation. But something in her voice made me pause. There was an edge to it, a coldness that felt different from her usual sharpness. I pressed myself against the wall of the hallway and listened, my heart beating faster than it should have. "Mom, you were right," Lydia was saying into her phone. "This is going to be easier than with Dad. This old man doesn't even have anyone to protect him. Margaret is gone. He has no other family, and Evan does whatever I tell him. It's almost too simple." I stopped breathing. My hand gripped the wall for support as her words sank into my chest like stones dropped into still water. Easier than with Dad. The phrase echoed in my mind, demanding interpretation. What had happened with her father? I knew almost nothing about Lydia's family history. She rarely spoke of her parents, and whenever the topic arose, she would change the subject with practiced ease. Her father had passed away several years before she married Evan, and I had always assumed it was simply too painful for her to discuss. Now, I wondered if the silence served a different purpose entirely. There was a pause as Dorothy apparently responded on the other end of the line. Then Lydia laughed, a sound entirely without warmth. I know, but this one is even less trouble. At least Dad tried to fight back at first. Franklin just sits there and takes it. He actually thinks if he stays quiet long enough, Evan will start defending him. It's pathetic, really. By the time he figures out what's happening, it will be too late." My legs felt weak beneath me. I wanted to storm into that kitchen and demand an explanation. I wanted to shake her by the shoulders and ask what she had done to her own father, what she was planning to do to me. But something held me back. Perhaps it was instinct, or perhaps it was the ghost of Margaret's voice whispering in my ear, reminding me that sometimes the wisest response to a predator is not to reveal that you have seen their teeth. I retreated silently back up the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. In my room, I sat on the edge of my bed and replayed her words over and over until the morning light began to creep through the curtains. Easier than with Dad. This old man doesn't even have anyone to protect him. By the time he figures out what is happening, it will be too late. The sentences assembled themselves into a picture I did not want to see, but could no longer ignore. In the days that followed, I began watching Lydia with new eyes. I noticed how she studied the house, running her fingers along the door frames and windowsills as if measuring their worth. I saw how she intercepted the mail before I could reach it, flipping through envelopes with keen interest before setting them aside. I observed the way she asked Evan casual questions about the property deed, about my bank accounts, about what would happen to everything when I was gone. Each observation added another piece to a puzzle I was only beginning to understand. I remembered then something Margaret had said years ago, long before she got sick. We had just returned from dinner at Evan and Lydia's apartment, and Margaret had been unusually quiet during the drive home. When I asked what was wrong, she stared out the window for a long moment before answering. "There's something wrong with that woman, Franklin. I have seen her kind before, people who smile while they calculate, who say all the right things while planning something else entirely. I cannot prove anything, but I feel it in my bones. Be careful with her." I had dismissed her concerns as maternal overprotectiveness. I had told her she was being unfair to our daughter-in-law. Another mistake in a long list of mistakes I would come to regret. Standing in that hallway at 2 a.m, hearing Lydia speak about me as if I were an obstacle to be removed, I finally understood what Margaret had been trying to tell me. And I made a decision that would change everything. I would not confront Lydia. I would not warn Evan. I would not give them any indication that I knew what they were planning. Instead, I would watch. I would wait. And I would prepare. That night, I stopped protecting them from who they were and started protecting myself. That decision to protect myself carried me through the following weeks, though I could not have imagined how quickly Lydia would move once she believed I was out of the way. I learned what was happening inside my former home, not from Evan, who never called, but from Rosemary and the other neighbors who had known Margaret and me for decades. Their reports came in fragments, each one more painful than the last, painting a picture of erasure so thorough it took my breath away. Within 3 days of my departure, Lydia had hired painters to cover the soft blue walls of the living room that Margaret had chosen 20 years earlier. The color she selected was a stark modern gray that belonged in a magazine rather than a home where a family had laughed and cried and built a lifetime of memories. Rosemary told me she had watched the painters carry their equipment inside, and when she asked Lydia about the renovation, my daughter-in-law had smiled brightly and said they were finally updating the place to something more contemporary. It was so dated, Lydia had explained, as if the history contained in those walls was nothing more than an inconvenience to be corrected. The furniture followed soon after. The oak dining table, where Margaret and I had shared thousands of meals, was replaced with something sleek and glass-topped. The comfortable sofa where our son had taken his first steps, where we had read him bedtime stories, where Margaret and I had sat together watching the evening news for 40 years, was hauled away by men in a truck and replaced with angular pieces that looked beautiful, but invited no one to sit and stay. Each change was a small death, a deliberate dismantling of everything Margaret and I had built together. But the worst came when Rosemary told me about the boxes. She had seen Lydia carrying them to the curb on trash day, cardboard boxes filled with items that had no business being discarded. Margaret's collection of ceramic birds that had sat on the windowsill since our 10th anniversary. The quilts her mother had sewn by hand passed down through 3 generations. Photo albums containing pictures that existed nowhere else, images of people and moments that could never be recovered. Lydia threw them away as casually as one might discard old newspapers, erasing my wife's presence from the home she had loved with brutal efficiency. Evan did nothing to stop her. According to the neighbors who dared to ask questions, he simply watched his wife transform the house and offered no objection. When Harold Patterson from across the street inquired about my whereabouts, wondering why he had not seen me tending the garden as I always did, Lydia answered before Evan could speak. Franklin wanted to live somewhere quieter, she said with practiced concern. The house was becoming too much for him. We offered to let him stay, of course, but he insisted. You know how stubborn older people can be about their independence. The lie flowed from her lips with such ease that Harold had nodded sympathetically, never suspecting that the truth was something far uglier. I heard these reports while sitting in Rosemary's guest room, feeling the walls of my old life collapse around me. But amid the grief and anger, a memory surfaced that changed everything. It was something Margaret had said to me about a year before she died during one of our evening walks around the neighborhood. We had paused in front of our house, admiring the way the sunset painted the windows gold when Margaret squeezed my hand and spoke in that thoughtful way she had when something important was on her mind. "This house will never belong to anyone who doesn't deserve it, Franklin. I have made sure of that. You will understand later." I had asked her what she meant, but she simply smiled and suggested we continue our walk before the light faded completely. At the time, I assumed she was speaking philosophically, expressing her belief that a home belongs to those who love it rather than those who merely occupy it. But sitting in Rosemary's house, watching everything I had built being systematically destroyed, her words took on a different meaning entirely. Margaret had been one of the most practical women I ever knew. She did not speak in vague metaphors or empty sentiments. When she said she had made sure of something, she meant exactly that. I thought about the drawer she had told me to open only when I truly needed to. I thought about Judith Keller, the lawyer friend whose name and number Margaret had pressed into my hands during her final days. I thought about all the quiet conversations Margaret had with people I didn't know, the appointments she kept without explanation, the papers she had asked me to sign over the years without reading too carefully, because I trusted her completely. Margaret had spent her last years preparing for something building protections I was only now beginning to glimpse. I stood up from the chair by Rosemary's window and made a decision. It was time to stop grieving what I had lost and start discovering what Margaret had left behind. Somewhere in that drawer was the answer to why my wife had been so certain that the house would never belong to anyone who did not deserve it. Somewhere in those papers was the weapon she had forged for a battle she knew I would eventually have to fight. Ownership and entitlement are not the same thing. Margaret had made sure of that. The morning after I made that decision, I woke to find my phone vibrating relentlessly on Rosemary's nightstand. I had turned off the ringer the night I left the house, unable to bear the thought of hearing Evan's voice or seeing Lydia's name flash across my screen. But even on silent mode, the device would not stop moving, buzzing against the wooden surface like a trapped insect desperate to escape. I picked it up and felt my stomach tighten at what I saw. 47 missed calls, all from Evan. 23 voicemails waiting to be heard, and a cascade of text messages that filled the screen with frantic, demanding words. I sat on the edge of the bed and began listening to the voicemails one by one, steeling myself for what I expected to be apologies and pleas for reconciliation. Instead, I found something far more revealing. The first message had been left at 6 a.m, Evan's voice tight with barely contained panic. "Dad, it's me. The bank called about the house. They said there's some kind of hold on the refinancing paperwork and they need your signature. Can you call me back? It's urgent." No greeting, no inquiry about my well-being, no acknowledgement that his wife had physically shoved me out of my own home while he stood there applauding. Just the bank, just the paperwork, just the house. The second message was similar, left 2 hours later, with an edge of irritation creeping into his tone. "Dad, I don't know why you're not answering. The bank is being difficult about something with the deed. They keep asking for the trustee's authorization, but I don't even know what that means. Call me back." The third message arrived that afternoon, Evan's voice now strained with something approaching desperation. "Look, I know things got heated the other night, but we need to deal with this house situation. Lydia found some documents that mention a trust and we need to understand what's going on. Please, Dad, this is important." I listened to all 23 voicemails over the course of an hour, each one more frantic than the last. Not a single message contained the words, "I'm sorry." Not once did Evan ask if I was safe, if I had a place to sleep, if I needed anything. The calls followed a clear pattern, beginning with demands disguised as requests, escalating to barely concealed frustration, and finally arriving at something close to begging. But even in the begging, there was no remorse, only need. Only want, only the house. The text messages told the same story. "Dad, where are you? The bank won't process anything without your signature. Dad, please respond. Lydia is freaking out about the trust documents. Why didn't you tell us about the trust? What else don't we know? Dad, this is serious. We could lose everything if you don't cooperate." I read each message with the detached clarity of someone who has finally stopped hoping for something that will never come. My son was not reaching out because he missed his father. He was reaching out because he had discovered an obstacle in his path, and that obstacle was me. I set the phone down and stared out the window at Rosemary's carefully tended garden. The roses Margaret had helped her plant 15 years ago were still blooming, their red petals bright against the morning light. I thought about all the years I had made excuses for Evan, all the times I had convinced myself that his silence in the face of Lydia's cruelty was weakness rather than choice. But there was no weakness in those voicemails. There was calculation. There was strategy. There was a man who had learned to see his father not as family, but as a means to an end. I was about to put the phone away when I noticed a text message from a number I didn't recognize. It had arrived sometime during the night, buried beneath Evan's avalanche of demands, and I had nearly missed it entirely. The message was brief, but its contents made my heart stop. Mr. Ward, I was a neighbor of the Collins family in Oregon. I know what your daughter-in-law did to her own father. If you want to talk, here's my number. My name is Robert Palmer. I read the message 3 times, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Oregon. The Collins family. Lydia's maiden name was Collins, but she had rarely spoken of her life before Evan. I knew her mother Dorothy lived somewhere on the West Coast, but Lydia had always been vague about the details. Her father had died before she and Evan married, and she described his passing with such dismissive brevity that I had learned not to ask questions. He was sick for a long time, she had said once. It was a relief when it was over. At the time, I thought she was simply uncomfortable with grief. Now I wondered if her discomfort stemmed from something else entirely. What had Lydia done to her own father? The question connected to everything I had overheard that night in the hallway when she had told her mother that I would be easier than Dad. Easier to what? Easier to manipulate, easier to remove. I thought of the way she had studied our house, the way she had asked Evan questions about property and inheritance, the way she had erased Margaret's presence with such cold efficiency. Was I simply the latest target in a pattern that had begun long before I ever met her? I saved Robert Palmer's number in my contacts and placed the phone back on the nightstand. I did not know yet what I would do with this information, but I knew it was important. Someone out there had answers to questions I had not even known to ask. Someone had witnessed what Lydia was capable of and had taken the trouble to find me and offer their knowledge. They weren't afraid for me. They were afraid of what I might know. I spent the rest of that morning sitting with my thoughts turning over the mysterious text message in my mind like a stone whose underside I was afraid to examine. When Rosemary knocked gently on the guest room door around noon, carrying a tray with tea and sandwiches she had prepared, I realized I had not eaten since the night before. She set the tray on the small desk by the window and settled into the worn armchair across from the bed, her kind eyes watching me with the patient concern of someone who has learned that grief cannot be rushed. Rosemary Hale had been Margaret's closest friend for over 40 years, since the day they met at a church bake sale, when both women were young mothers navigating the chaos of raising small children. Their friendship had deepened through decades of shared joys and sorrows, through the raising of children and the bearing of parents, through all the ordinary and extraordinary moments that compose a life. When Margaret got sick, Rosemary had been there every day, sitting by her bedside, holding her hand, listening to words my wife could not bring herself to share with me. I had always been grateful for their bond, though I never fully understood its depth until now. Her home reflected that friendship in every corner. Photographs of the two women covered nearly every available surface, images spanning 4 decades of memories. Margaret and Rosemary at a beach vacation in their 30s, laughing with the wind in their hair. The two of them at Evan's high school graduation, standing proudly beside me while our son held his diploma. A more recent photo from just a year before Margaret's diagnosis. Both women sitting on this very porch with cups of coffee and contented smiles. Being surrounded by these images brought me a comfort I had not expected, as if Margaret's presence still lingered in these rooms where she had spent so many happy hours. "Franklin," Rosemary said softly, breaking the silence that had settled between us. "Margaret was my closest friend in this world. She told me things before she died, things she couldn't tell you because she knew you would try to fix them too soon before you were ready." She paused, her weathered hands folded in her lap. She knew this day would come. Maybe not exactly how or when, but she knew. And she prepared for it. I looked up from my untouched tea, searching her face for answers. "What do you mean she prepared?" "Prepared how?" Rosemary smiled, but there was sadness in it. "Your wife was one of the wisest women I ever knew. She understood people in ways most of us never learn, and she understood Lydia from the very beginning." She leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on the weight of something long held and finally ready to be released. Margaret told me once that kindness without boundaries is an invitation to be used. She lived her whole life being generous and open, but she also knew when to draw lines. She worried about you, Franklin. She worried that your good heart would keep you from seeing danger until it was too late. The words struck me with unexpected force. Kindness without boundaries is an invitation to be used. It was such a simple phrase, yet it captured everything I had failed to understand about my own situation. I had believed that enduring Lydia's cruelties was an act of love, a sacrifice made for the sake of family harmony. But Margaret had seen it differently. She had seen it as surrender as an open door through which predators could walk unchallenged. As Rosemary spoke, my eyes wandered around the room, taking in the familiar photographs and the comfortable clutter of a home well lived in. On a shelf near the window, tucked between a ceramic vase and a stack of old books, I noticed something that seemed out of place. A small USB drive, its plastic casing faded with age, sat propped against a framed photo of Margaret and Rosemary from what looked like a birthday celebration. I had seen enough of these devices during my years at the post office to recognize one, though I had never owned one myself. "What's that?" I asked, nodding toward the shelf. Rosemary followed my gaze, and her smile deepened, taking on a quality I could not quite name. "That's a keepsake," she said. "Margaret gave it to me a few months before she passed. She liked to document things, you know. She was thorough. She always said that memories fade, but records remain." She paused, seeming to weigh her next words carefully. "She asked me to keep it safe. She said there might come a time when you would need what's on it." I wanted to ask more, to demand that she tell me everything Margaret had entrusted to her, but something in Rosemary's expression told me the time for those revelations had not yet arrived. Instead, she reached across the space between us and took my hand in hers, her grip warm and steady. "Margaret asked me to watch over you," she said quietly. "She made me promise to keep an eye on things, to keep records just in case. I didn't fully understand why at the time, but I trusted her judgment. I've been watching, Franklin. I've been documenting, and when you're ready, when the moment is right, you'll have everything you need." I sat in stunned silence, trying to process what I was hearing. My wife had spent her final months not only preparing legal protections I was just beginning to discover, but also enlisting her closest friend as a witness and guardian. She had built a network of safeguards around me, anticipating a threat I had refused to see, loving me enough to protect me even from beyond the grave. For the first time, I realized Margaret's love hadn't ended with her last breath. Rosemary's words stayed with me through the night, echoing in my mind as I lay awake in her guest room, watching shadows move across the ceiling. By morning, I knew I could not wait any longer. Whatever Margaret had left for me in that drawer, whatever secrets she had hidden away against this very day, I needed to see them for myself. I thanked Rosemary for her hospitality and told her I would return before evening. Then I drove to the house where I had lived for 40 years, parking down the street where Lydia would not notice my car, and waited until I saw her drive away with Evan beside her. Only then did I approach the home that no longer felt like mine. The spare key was still hidden beneath the loose brick by the garden shed, exactly where Margaret and I had kept it for 3 decades. I let myself in through the back door, moving quickly through rooms that already looked foreign, with their new gray walls and angular furniture. The old desk where Margaret had paid bills and written letters to distant relatives still sat in the corner of what used to be our shared office, though Lydia had pushed it aside to make room for a modern glass table. I knelt before it and pulled open the bottom drawer on the left side, the one Margaret had pointed to during those final weeks when her voice was barely a whisper, but her eyes still burned with purpose. Inside, I found exactly what she had described. A sealed envelope with my name written across it in her familiar handwriting, the letters slightly shaky but unmistakably hers. Beneath it lay a stack of legal documents bound with a rubber band, and at the bottom a manila folder marked simply "Private" in bold black letters. I gathered everything into my arms and left the house as quietly as I had entered, my heart pounding so loudly I was certain the neighbors could hear it. Back in my car, parked beneath the shade of an old oak tree at the edge of the neighborhood, I opened the envelope first. The letter inside was dated 3 years before Margaret's death, written during a time when she had seemed perfectly healthy and our lives had appeared settled and secure. The paper was cream-colored, the kind she used for important correspondence, and her words filled both sides of the page. "My dearest Franklin," the letter began. If you are reading this, then Lydia has done what I feared she would do from the moment I first met her. I saw it that very first day when Evan brought her home to introduce us. You saw a charming young woman who made our son smile. I saw something else entirely. I saw the way she looked at our home. Not as a sanctuary where a family had built a life together, but as a prize to be won. Not with love, but with calculation. I knew then that she was dangerous, though I had no proof, and you would never have believed me if I had tried to explain. I have spent the years since watching and preparing. I hired people to investigate her past, and what they found confirmed my worst suspicions. I have put legal protections in place that she cannot easily overcome, and I have left everything with Judith Keller, my attorney and dear friend, who has instructions to help you when the time comes. Find her, Franklin. She has everything you will need. Trust her as you would trust me. I know you will be hurt that I kept this from you. I know you will wonder why I didn't simply tell you the truth. But I know you, my love. I know your kind heart and your desire to see the good in everyone, especially those our son has chosen. If I had told you my fears, you would have tried to fix things. You would have confronted Lydia, warned Evan, brought the conflict into the open before you were ready to win it, and she would have adapted. She would have hidden her true nature more carefully and waited for a better moment to strike. So instead, I worked in silence, building walls you did not know existed, preparing weapons you did not know you would need. If you are reading this letter, then those walls are holding and those weapons are ready. Use them, Franklin. Protect yourself and know that everything I did because I love you more than I have ever been able to say. Yours always and forever, Margaret. The tears came before I could stop them rolling down my cheeks and falling onto the paper that my wife had written so many years ago. I sat in that car beneath the oak tree and wept for the woman who had known me better than I knew myself, who had seen a threat I was too blind to recognize, who had spent her final years not in peaceful retirement, but in quiet battle against an enemy I had welcomed into our home. When the tears subsided, I opened the manila folder marked Private. Inside were receipts and invoices from a private investigation firm based in Philadelphia dating back 5 years. The amounts were substantial thousands of dollars that Margaret must have taken from her personal savings without my knowledge. Attached to the receipts was a summary report, professional and detailed, documenting the investigation's findings. The report focused on the Collins family of Portland, Oregon. It described a man named James Collins, Lydia's father, who had owned a modest home in a quiet neighborhood. It detailed how James had fallen ill with early onset dementia, how his daughter Lydia had obtained power of attorney during his decline, how the family home had been sold and the proceeds had vanished into accounts that could not be traced. It mentioned an investigation by Oregon Adult Protective Services into allegations of elder financial abuse, an investigation that had been closed due to insufficient evidence after James Collins died alone in a low-cost nursing facility 3 years before Lydia married my son. I read the report twice, then a third time, each word confirming what I had begun to suspect but had not wanted to believe. Lydia had done this before. She had targeted her own father, stripped him of everything he owned, and left him to die, forgotten and alone. And now she was trying to do the same thing to me. Margaret hadn't just loved me. She had armored me. The discovery of Margaret's secret preparations left me shaken, but strangely calm, as if a puzzle I had been struggling with for years had finally revealed its completed picture. I drove directly from my hiding spot beneath the oak tree to the address written on Judith Keller's business card, a modest office building on the edge of downtown that housed a handful of small law firms and accounting practices. The building was older but well-maintained, with brass fixtures on the doors and the kind of quiet dignity that spoke of professionals who valued substance over flash. I found Judith's name on the directory and took the elevator to the 3rd floor, clutching Margaret's letter and the investigation folder against my chest like precious cargo. Judith Keller opened the door herself when I knocked, as if she had been waiting by it for my arrival. She was 63 years old, according to the documents Margaret had left, with silver hair cut short and practical sharp eyes behind elegant reading glasses, and the kind of posture that suggested she had spent a lifetime refusing to be intimidated. Her handshake was firm, and her smile was warm, though I could see something like relief flickering behind her professional composure. "Franklin Ward," she said, stepping aside to usher me into her office. "I've been waiting for your call. though I suppose showing up in person works just as well. She gestured toward a comfortable chair across from her desk and closed the door behind us. Margaret prepared me for this day. She told me exactly what would happen and approximately when. I have to say her prediction was remarkably accurate. I settled into the chair, still clutching the documents I had retrieved from the drawer. "You knew about Lydia, about everything?" Judith nodded, moving to her own seat behind a desk covered with neatly organized files. "Margaret came to me 5 years ago with concerns about your daughter-in-law. At first, I thought she might be overreacting the way protective mothers sometimes do when their sons marry women they don't approve of. But Margaret was never the overreacting type. She presented me with research. She had already begun gathering suspicions based on observations she had made over the years, patterns of behavior that troubled her deeply. I agreed to help her investigate further, and what we found confirmed her worst fears." She reached into a drawer and pulled out a thick folder that looked far more comprehensive than the one I had discovered in Margaret's desk. "This is the complete file. Margaret kept a summary copy at home for you to find, but she entrusted the full documentation to me for safekeeping. It contains everything we uncovered about Lydia's past, including detailed records of what happened to her father, James Collins, in Oregon. It also contains the legal instruments Margaret created to protect you." Judith opened the folder and spread several documents across her desk, turning them so I could read along as she explained. 3 years before she passed, Margaret established a living trust that governs the ownership and disposition of your home and primary assets. The trust names you as both the primary beneficiary and the sole trustee, which means you have complete control over all decisions regarding the property. Evan is listed as a contingent beneficiary, meaning he would inherit only under specific circumstances. She pointed to a paragraph highlighted in yellow on one of the pages. This is Clause 7, the provision Margaret was most insistent about including. It states that if you are ever forced to leave your primary residence without providing written consent, or if there is documented evidence of elder abuse or financial exploitation, Evan's status as contingent beneficiary is automatically revoked. In that event, all assets held by the trust transfer immediately to the Elder Protection Foundation, a charity Margaret supported for many years. I read the clause 3 times, letting its implications sink in. So when Lydia pushed me out of the house, she triggered the very provision Margaret designed to protect you, Judith confirmed. Your son and his wife have been living in that house as guests, not as owners or even tenants. There is no lease agreement, no rental contract, nothing that gives them any legal right to occupy the property. As trustee, you have the authority to require them to vacate with 30 days written notice. They have no grounds to contest this, no legal standing to remain. The weight of what Margaret had accomplished began to settle over me. She had seen the threat years before it materialized and had built a fortress of legal protections around me, walls that Lydia could not climb and gates that only I could open. Every document, every clause, every carefully worded provision was a testament to my wife's love and her fierce determination to keep me safe even after she was gone. Judith leaned back in her chair, studying me with those sharp, compassionate eyes. There's one more thing Margaret mentioned that I've never fully understood. She told me she had installed security cameras in your home several years ago, cameras that recorded activity in the common areas without anyone's knowledge. She said if the time ever came when you needed that footage, Rosemary would know where to find it. She paused, letting the information hang in the air between us. I don't know what's on those recordings, Franklin, but Margaret seemed to believe it would be important. I thought of the USB drive on Rosemary's shelf, the keepsake she had described with that mysterious smile. Margaret liked to document things Rosemary had said. She was thorough. Now I understood just how thorough my wife had been. She had not only built legal walls to protect me, but had also gathered evidence of the enemy's movements footage that could prove exactly how Lydia and Evan had treated me when they thought no one was watching. Judith gathered the documents and placed them back in the folder, then slid it across the desk toward me. Take your time reviewing everything. When you're ready to act, I'll be here. Margaret paid my retainer in full 5 years ago, so my services are already secured on your behalf. I accepted the folder with hands that trembled slightly, overwhelmed by the scope of what my wife had done. She had anticipated every move, prepared for every contingency, armed me with weapons I was only now learning to wield. Justice doesn't rush, it waits. And Margaret had given it a seat at the table. In the days that followed my meeting with Judith, I returned to Rosemary's house and waited Waiting is not something I had ever been particularly good at, having spent most of my adult life in constant motion, walking miles each day to deliver mail to every home in our community. But Margaret had taught me through her careful preparations that patience was not the same as passivity. Sometimes the wisest course of action was to let events unfold, to allow the enemy to reveal themselves through their own desperate movements. So I waited and I watched, and Rosemary kept me informed of everything that happened at the house I had left behind. The first sign that Lydia's carefully constructed plans were beginning to crumble came 3 days after I visited Judith's office. Rosemary had spoken to Patricia Donovan, who worked as a loan officer at the local bank, where Lydia had apparently attempted to refinance the mortgage on my home. Patricia was not supposed to share details of client interactions, but she and Rosemary had been friends for 20 years, and the conversation Lydia had caused at the bank was too remarkable to keep entirely private. According to Patricia, Lydia had arrived at the bank with a folder full of documents and a confident smile, expecting the refinancing process to be a simple formality. She had presented herself as the effective owner of the property, explaining that her elderly father-in-law had moved out and that she and her husband were now responsible for the home. But when Patricia ran the property records through the system, she discovered something that made Lydia's confident smile vanish instantly. The house was held in a trust, and any financial decisions regarding the property required authorization from the trustee, a man named Franklin Ward. Rosemary described how Patricia had watched Lydia's face transform from confusion to disbelief to barely contained fury within the span of 30 seconds. There must be some mistake, Lydia had insisted, her voice rising loud enough for other customers to hear. My father-in-law never mentioned any trust. He's just a retired postal worker. He doesn't know anything about trusts. But the records were clear, and no amount of arguing could change what was written in black and white. Lydia had stormed out of the bank without completing any paperwork, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor like gunshots. That same evening, Rosemary reported hearing raised voices coming from my former home. She had been watering her garden, which sat close enough to the property line to catch fragments of conversation through open windows. Lydia was on the phone with someone, her tone sharp and panicked in a way Rosemary had never heard before. "Mom? Something is wrong." Lydia had said, her words carrying clearly through the summer air. "This old man is not as simple as Dad was. There is some kind of legal protection I did not know about. The bank will not touch anything without his signature. What am I supposed to do now?" The mention of her father sent a chill down my spine when Rosemary relayed the conversation. Lydia had compared me to her father, the man she had stripped of everything and abandoned to die alone. She had expected me to be just as easy to manipulate, just as defenseless against her schemes. The discovery that Margaret had built walls Lydia could not breach was clearly throwing her entire strategy into chaos. But the cracks were not limited to Lydia's dealings with banks and lawyers. Rosemary told me that Evan had also begun to change his usual passive silence, giving way to questions and challenges that surprised everyone who witnessed them. Neighbors had seen the couple arguing in their driveway, Evan's voice raised in a way none of them had ever heard before. "Did you know about this trust?" he had demanded, loud enough for Harold Patterson across the street to catch every word. "Did you know what you were getting us into? What else haven't you told me?" Lydia's response had been swift and vicious, her carefully maintained mask slipping to reveal the cold contempt beneath. "I am handling it," she had snapped at her husband, her voice dripping with disdain. "Just stay out of my way like you always do. You have never been useful for anything except standing there and agreeing with me. Do not start pretending to have a spine now." The neighbors were beginning to talk. People who had accepted Lydia's explanation that I had simply wanted to live somewhere quieter were now whispering different theories. Why had Franklin left so suddenly? Why had no one seen him since that night? Why was Lydia so desperate to refinance a house that should have been stable and secure? The questions multiplied with each passing day, and Lydia's attempts to maintain her public image grew increasingly frantic and unconvincing. I listened to Rosemary's reports and felt something I had not expected. Not satisfaction, not triumph, but a kind of sad recognition. Lydia had built her entire life on control and manipulation, on the certainty that she could bend others to her will through charm or force or sheer, relentless pressure. Now that certainty was cracking and the person underneath was emerging for everyone to see. Power sounds loudest right before it breaks. Watching Lydia's control begin to fracture gave me no pleasure, only a deepening sense of unease about the woman my son had married. The investigation report Margaret had left me contained facts and dates and official documents, but it lacked the human dimension, the lived experience of someone who had witnessed firsthand what Lydia was capable of doing. That was why, on a quiet Tuesday morning while Rosemary tended her garden, I finally picked up my phone and dialed the number that had appeared in my messages days earlier. The number belonging to Robert Palmer, the stranger from Oregon, who claimed to know what my daughter-in-law had done to her own father. He answered on the third ring, his voice carrying the slight tremor of age but also a sharpness that told me this was a man whose mind remained clear. "Mr. Ward," he said before I could introduce myself, "I was hoping you would call. I've been waiting to tell this story to someone who might actually be able to use it." Robert Palmer was 70 years old, a retired electrician who had lived next door to James Collins in a modest Portland neighborhood for nearly 15 years. He and James had become close friends in the way that neighbors sometimes do, sharing tools and advice, watching football games together on Sunday afternoons, looking out for each other as they both navigated the challenges of aging alone. Robert's wife had passed away from a stroke 8 years earlier, and James's wife had died of cancer long before that. Their shared grief had forged a bond that Robert still spoke of with obvious emotion. James was a good man. Robert told me, his voice heavy with memory. Worked as an accountant for 30 years, saved every penny, paid off his house by the time he was 55. He was proud of that house. It wasn't fancy, just a simple 3-bedroom ranch, but it was his. He used to say it was the only thing he had to leave his daughter, the only proof that his life had meant something. The daughter, of course, was Lydia. Robert described how she had visited rarely during the years he knew James, appearing perhaps once or twice annually for brief perfunctory visits that always seemed to leave James more sad than happy. But everything changed when James began showing signs of cognitive decline around age 72. The forgetfulness that had seemed harmless at first gradually worsened, and within a year, James was struggling to manage his daily affairs. That was when Lydia suddenly became very interested in her father's well-being. She showed up one day with papers, Robert said, his tone hardening. Told James she wanted to help him manage his finances, that it would be easier if she had power of attorney so she could handle things while he focused on his health. James trusted her. She was his daughter. He signed whatever she put in front of him without really understanding what he was agreeing to. Within 6 months, James Collins no longer owned his home. Lydia had convinced him to transfer the deed into her name, assuring him it was for tax purposes, for estate planning, for reasons that sounded plausible to a man whose mind was slowly betraying him. She sold the house 3 months later, pocketing the proceeds, and moving James into a low-cost nursing facility on the outskirts of the city, a place Robert described with barely contained anger as somewhere people went to be forgotten. "I tried to visit him there," Robert continued. "Drove 40 minutes each way every week for the first year, but Lydia had put herself down as his only approved contact. She told the staff I was upsetting him, that my visits were causing confusion. They stopped letting me in. The last time I saw James, he was sitting in a wheelchair by a window staring at nothing. He didn't even recognize me." James Collins died 3 years after entering that facility alone and confused, without a single family member present. Robert had learned of his death only by reading the obituary in the local paper, a brief notice that mentioned no service, no surviving family, nothing but a name and 2 dates marking the boundaries of a life that had been systematically erased. "There was an investigation," Robert said. "I reported everything to Adult Protective Services. They opened a case for elder financial abuse, started gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses. But James died before they could complete their work. Without the victim, without his testimony, the case fell apart. Lydia walked away clean." I sat in Rosemary's guest room with the phone pressed against my ear, feeling sick in a way that had nothing to do with physical illness. Everything Robert described matched the summary in Margaret's investigation file. But hearing it from someone who had witnessed the destruction firsthand made it terribly, undeniably real. Lydia had not simply made a mistake with her father or fallen into a bad situation that spiraled out of control. She had systematically targeted a vulnerable old man, manipulated him out of everything he owned, and abandoned him to die alone. And she had done it with such practiced efficiency that Robert believed, as Margaret must have believed, that James was not her first victim and would not be her last. Your wife contacted me about 4 years ago, Robert added, surprising me. Margaret Wright? She hired some investigators who tracked me down. We talked for almost 2 hours. She wanted to know everything, every detail, every document I still had from when I tried to help James. I gave her copies of everything. She said she was trying to protect her husband from the same fate. Margaret had known. She had found Robert Palmer heard his testimony, understood exactly what kind of person had married our son. And rather than confronting Lydia directly or warning me in ways that might have provoked a premature crisis, she had quietly built her defenses and waited for the day when I would need them. Her foresight left me breathless with gratitude and grief in equal measure. I thanked Robert for his time and his willingness to share such painful memories. Before we hung up, he offered one final thought that would stay with me long after our conversation ended. Mr. Ward, people like Lydia don't change. They just find new targets. Your wife understood that. I hope you do too. I set down the phone and stared at the wall of Rosemary's guest room, seeing nothing but the face of my daughter-in-law as I had known her for years. The charming smiles, the solicitous questions about my health, the way she had inserted herself into every aspect of our family's life. None of it had been real. I had never been a father-in-law to her, never been family, never been anything but a target she was patiently working to exploit. She wasn't a daughter-in-law who went wrong. She was a predator who found new prey. The conversation with Robert Palmer confirmed what I had suspected, but desperately hoped was not true. Lydia was not merely a difficult woman or an unkind daughter-in-law. She was something far more dangerous, a pattern predator who had honed her skills on her own father before turning her attention to me. Armed with this knowledge and the documentation to prove it, I made a decision that Rosemary questioned but ultimately supported. I needed to speak with my son. Not through lawyers or intermediaries, but face-to-face, man-to-man, father to son. Whatever Evan had become under Lydia's influence, he deserved the chance to see the truth before events moved beyond anyone's control. I called him from Rosemary's phone, knowing he would not answer a call from my own number. His voice when he picked up was wary and confused, clearly not recognizing the caller. "Evan," I said before he could hang up. "It's your father. I need to see you, alone. There are things you need to know." We met the following afternoon at a small coffee shop on the far side of town, a place neither of us had ever visited, where we were unlikely to encounter anyone we knew. Evan arrived looking haggard, dark circles under his eyes, and a nervousness in his movements that told me the past weeks had taken their toll on him as well. He slid into the booth across from me without greeting his eyes, immediately falling to the manila folder I had placed on the table between us. "What is that?" he asked, though something in his voice suggested he already feared the answer. "The truth about your wife," I replied. "The truth about what she did to her own father before she ever met you." I pushed the folders toward him and watched as he opened it with trembling hands. Inside were copies of the investigation reports, Robert Palmer's written statement, newspaper clippings about James Collins's death, and the summary from Adult Protective Services that documented the elder abuse case that had been dropped when its victim died alone in a nursing home. Evan read in silence, his face growing paler with each page he turned. "She told me her father abandoned the family," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She said he walked out when she was a teenager and they never heard from him again. She said he was a terrible person who didn't deserve to be discussed. His name was James Collins," I said quietly. "He was a retired accountant who loved his daughter and trusted her completely. She used that trust to take everything he had, then left him to die, forgotten and alone. The same thing she planned to do to me." Evan stared at the documents as if they might rearrange themselves into something less damning. But the evidence was clear, and even his well-practiced ability to ignore uncomfortable truths could not withstand such overwhelming proof. I watched his face as memories seemed to surface, unbidden connections forming that he had refused to make for years. "She cut me off from everyone," he said slowly, as if speaking to himself rather than to me. "My college friends, my work colleagues, even my cousins. Every time I wanted to spend time with anyone outside our marriage, she had a reason why it was a bad idea. Eventually, I just stopped trying." He looked up at me with eyes that held a dawning horror. "She controlled all our finances from the beginning. I don't even know what accounts we have or how much money is in them. She said it was easier if one person managed everything." The parallels to James Collins's experience were impossible to miss. Lydia had used the same playbook on my son that she had used on her father, isolating him, controlling him, making him dependent on her for information and approval. The only difference was that Evan was younger and healthier, so she had needed more time to complete her work. "Do you remember Mom's funeral?" I asked gently. Evan's face crumpled at the question, and I knew the memory I was about to invoke was already rising in his mind. "Lydia complained," he said, his voice cracking. Mom's body was still in the church, and Lydia leaned over and whispered that she couldn't believe how long this was taking. She asked when we could leave. He pressed his hands against his eyes as if trying to block out the image. I should have said something. I should have told her that was wrong, but I just sat there and pretended I hadn't heard. "You sat there," I agreed, "because that's what she trained you to do. But you're not sitting there now, Evan. You're here looking at the truth, making a choice about what kind of man you want to be." The silence that followed was the longest of my life. Evan stared at the folder at me, at his own hands resting uselessly on the table. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight I had never heard from him before. "I should have protected you, Dad. All those years. All those times she belittled you and excluded you and made you feel unwelcome in your own home. I should have stood up for you. I should have been your son." He met my eyes, and I saw tears forming in his. "I was a coward. I'm sorry." The words hung in the air between us, inadequate and yet somehow enough. An apology could not undo the years of silence or erase the image of his hands clapping while his wife threw me out of my home. But it was a beginning, a crack in the wall he had built around himself, a first step toward becoming someone different. Regret came too late, but it finally came. My conversation with Evan left me feeling something I had not expected, a fragile hope that perhaps my son was not entirely lost to the woman who had shaped him into her accomplice. But hope alone would not be enough to resolve what lay ahead. As I drove back to Rosemary's house that evening, my mind kept returning to something Judith had mentioned during our meeting, something I had not yet fully explored. Margaret had installed security cameras in our home cameras that had recorded years of activity without anyone's knowledge, and Judith had said that Rosemary would know where to find the footage. I found Rosemary sitting on her porch in the fading light, a cup of tea growing cold beside her as she watched the fireflies beginning their nightly dance across her lawn. She looked up as I approached, and something in my expression must have told her that the time for partial revelations had passed. "You want to know about the cameras?" she said before I could speak. It was not a question. I settled into the chair beside her and nodded. "Judith mentioned them. She said Margaret told her you would know where the footage was kept." Rosemary was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond her garden. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of a secret held too long. "Margaret installed hidden cameras in your house 4 years ago, not long after she first came to me with her concerns about Lydia. Small devices carefully placed in the living room, the kitchen, the hallway. She wanted to document what was happening when she wasn't there to witness it herself." She paused, then continued more softly. "She asked me to keep the recordings safe. She knew she might not live long enough to use them herself." Rosemary rose from her chair and disappeared into the house, returning moments later with the USB drive I had noticed on her shelf days earlier. She pressed it into my hands with a solemnity that made the small device feel far heavier than its physical weight. "Everything is on here," she said. 4 years of footage organized by date and time. I reviewed some of it after Margaret passed just to make sure it had recorded properly. What I saw made me understand why Margaret had gone to such lengths. That night, Rosemary and I sat together at her kitchen table and watched the recordings on her old laptop computer. The footage was grainy but clear enough, capturing scenes from my former home that made my stomach turn with each passing minute. There was Lydia speaking on the phone to her mother, Dorothy, her voice dripping with contempt as she discussed me in terms that stripped away any pretense of family affection. "The old man just sits there like furniture," she had said in one recording. "He has no idea what's coming. By the time he figures it out, we'll own everything." There was footage of her walking through the house with a real estate agent pointing out features and discussing potential market values while I was away visiting Margaret's grave. There were dozens of smaller moments, casual cruelties spoken, when she believed no one was listening, revealing the true face she had hidden behind years of practiced smiles. But the recordings were not the only evidence Rosemary had kept. When the final video ended, she reached beneath the table and produced a worn leather journal. its pages filled with her careful handwriting. Margaret asked me to be a witness, Rosemary explained, opening the journal to show me entries dating back more than 2 years. She knew that cameras could malfunction, that digital files could be questioned or dismissed, so she asked me to keep a written record as well. Every time I observed Lydia treating you poorly, every conversation I overheard, every suspicious behavior I noticed, I wrote it down. Dates, times, exact words whenever I could remember them. I paged through the journal in stunned silence, reading entry after entry that documented the systematic campaign of disrespect and manipulation I had endured. Rosemary had been watching all along, recording everything with the meticulous attention of someone who understood that truth requires documentation to survive. The following day, the three of us gathered in Judith's office. Rosemary brought the USB drive and her journal. I brought the Oregon investigation file and Robert Palmer's contact information. Judith added the trust documents and legal instruments Margaret had created. Together, we spread everything across her conference table, assembling a comprehensive picture of who Lydia truly was and what she had attempted to do. "This is more than enough," Judith said, as she surveyed the assembled evidence. "The videos establish a pattern of behavior and intent. The journal provides corroborating testimony from an independent witness. The Oregon file demonstrates that this is not an isolated incident, but part of a lifelong pattern of predation. And the trust documents prove that Margaret anticipated exactly this situation and prepared accordingly." I looked at the mountain of evidence my wife had gathered, the network of protections she had built, the witnesses she had enlisted in her quiet war against a threat I had been too blind to see. Margaret had fought this battle for years without ever telling me, sacrificing her peace and her precious remaining time to ensure that when the moment came, I would not face it alone. The truth didn't need to shout. It only needed witnesses. With the evidence assembled and the legal framework firmly in place, Judith moved forward with the precision Margaret had always admired in her. 3 days after our meeting, a certified letter arrived at the house I had once called home, addressed to both Lydia and Evan Ward. I was not present when they received it, but Rosemary watched from her garden as the postal carrier approached their door, and she later described how Lydia's face transformed as she read the contents on her front porch. The letter was formal and devastating in its clarity. It informed Lydia and Evan that they were required to vacate the property within 30 days, citing their status as guests with no legal right to occupy the premises. It referenced Clause 7 of the Living Trust, explaining that by forcing me to leave my primary residence without written consent, they had triggered the automatic revocation of any inheritance rights. It noted that documented evidence of elder mistreatment had been compiled and would be submitted to the appropriate authorities if necessary. And it provided contact information for Judith's office should they wish to discuss the matter with legal representation of their own. According to the neighbors who witnessed the aftermath, Lydia spent the following week in a frenzy of desperate activity. She contacted every attorney in the county seeking someone who would take her case and fight the trust provisions Margaret had so carefully constructed. But lawyers talked to one another, and word of the evidence against her spread quickly through the local legal community. Rosemary heard from a friend whose son worked at a downtown firm that Lydia had been turned away by at least 6 different offices, each one declining to represent her after reviewing the documentation Judith had prepared. One attorney, braver, or perhaps more blunt than the others, reportedly told Lydia exactly why no one would help her. "You don't have a defense," he had said, sliding her folder back across his desk. "You have a history. The Oregon case alone would destroy your credibility in any courtroom. Add the video evidence and the witness testimony, and you're not looking at a legal battle. You're looking at a public exposure that will follow you for the rest of your life." The community that had welcomed Lydia as a charming young wife and devoted mother began to see her differently as whispers spread through church groups and neighborhood gatherings. The same people who had accepted her explanation of my departure now learned the truth from sources they trusted, friends of Rosemary who had heard the real story, acquaintances of Judith who understood the legal situation. One by one, the invitations stopped coming. The phone calls went unanswered. The women who had shared coffee with Lydia at the church fellowship hall began crossing to the other side of the street when they saw her approaching. The church group itself delivered perhaps the most painful rejection. Lydia had joined the women's ministry shortly after marrying Evan, using it as a platform to build her reputation as a caring, community-minded person. But when the ministry leader learned what had happened, she called Lydia personally and asked her not to return. "We're a community built on honesty and compassion," the woman reportedly said. "What you've done to your father-in-law, what you did to your own father, that's not something we can overlook. I think it would be best for everyone if you found another congregation." Even Dorothy, the mother who had coached Lydia through the exploitation of James Collins and encouraged her pursuit of my assets, began to distance herself from the disaster her daughter had created. Rosemary overheard one of their phone conversations through the open window, Dorothy's voice sharp with recrimination rather than support. "I told you to be more careful," Dorothy had snapped. "I told you these things take time, that you can't rush them. But you got too greedy too fast. You pushed when you should have waited. And now look at the mess you've made. Don't expect me to clean it up for you." The isolation that descended on Lydia was complete and merciless. She had built her entire adult life on manipulation and deception, constructing an image of herself that required constant maintenance and the cooperation of everyone around her. Now that image lay in ruins, and the people she had counted on for support had vanished like morning mist. She had no friends who truly knew her because she had never allowed anyone to see her true self. She had no family willing to stand beside her because her family understood exactly what she was capable of doing to those closest to her. She had no resources of her own because she had always relied on taking from others rather than building something herself. I watched all of this unfold from a distance, receiving reports from Rosemary and updates from Judith, feeling none of the satisfaction I might have expected. There was no joy in watching a person's life collapse, even a person who had caused so much harm. But there was something like justice in seeing the consequences of cruelty finally catch up with someone who had evaded them for so long. Lydia had spent years believing she was smarter than everyone around her, that her charm and cunning would always protect her from accountability. She had been wrong. No one pushed her away. The truth simply made standing near her impossible. The 30 days passed slowly, each one bringing new reports of Lydia's deteriorating situation. She had moved out of the house a week before the deadline, unable to face the final humiliation of being formally evicted from a property she had believed would soon be hers. Where she went, I didn't know and didn't ask. My concern was no longer with Lydia Ward, but with the son she had left behind, the man I had raised, who was now facing the wreckage of the life he had built on her lies. Evan called me on a Tuesday morning, his voice quiet and uncertain in a way I had never heard before. He asked if I would meet him at the house where I had lived for 40 years, where his mother had died, where he had stood and applauded while his wife threw me into the street. I hesitated before agreeing, unsure what he wanted or what I was prepared to give him. But he was still my son, and despite everything that had happened, that bond remained unbroken beneath all the damage that had been done to it. I arrived at the house in the late afternoon, parking in the driveway where my car had sat for decades before Lydia decided I was no longer welcome. The gray paint she had chosen for the walls was already beginning to look tired, as if the house itself rejected the changes she had forced upon it. The angular furniture, visible through the windows, seemed cold and unwelcoming, a reflection of the woman who had selected it. But it was still my home, still the place where Margaret and I had built our life together, and seeing it again stirred emotions I had tried to keep at bay. Evan opened the door before I could knock his face pale and drawn from weeks of sleepless nights and difficult decisions. He was holding a manila envelope, clutching it against his chest the way I had clutched Margaret's belongings on the night I was forced to leave. He stepped aside to let me enter, and I walked into the living room where my exile had begun, feeling the weight of memory pressing against me from every direction. "Dad," Evan said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I need to show you something." He held out the envelope, and I took it with hands that trembled slightly despite my efforts to remain composed. Inside were legal documents, pages filled with formal language and official stamps. It took me a moment to understand what I was seeing, but when the realization dawned, I looked up at my son with surprise I could not conceal. "Divorce papers," Evan said. "I filed last week. The court processed them yesterday. It's done." I stared at the documents, reading the words that formally dissolved the marriage between Evan Ward and Lydia Collins Ward. After everything that had happened, after all the years of manipulation and control, my son had finally found the courage to free himself from the woman who had nearly destroyed us both. I should have done it years ago. Evan continued, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. I should have seen what she was from the beginning. Mom saw it. You saw it eventually, but I was too weak, too comfortable, too afraid of being alone to face the truth. He paused, drawing a deep breath. I'm not afraid anymore. What happened next caught me completely off guard. Evan straightened his shoulders and looked directly into my eyes, holding my gaze with an intensity I had rarely seen from him. Then, slowly and deliberately, he brought his hands together and began to clap. The sound echoed through the empty room, each impact of palm against palm, carrying a weight far beyond its physical force. I stood frozen, transported instantly back to the night when those same hands had applauded my humiliation, when my own son had celebrated my exile from the home I had built. But there was nothing mocking in his expression now, no cruelty or dismissal. There was only sorrow and determination, and something that looked very much like the beginning of redemption. This is the applause I should have given you from the beginning, Dad, Evan said, his voice breaking on the words. I applauded the wrong person. I stood there and clapped while the woman I married destroyed everything that mattered. I was a coward and a fool, and I will never forgive myself for what I did to you that night. The clapping stopped, and he let his hands fall to his sides. I'm sorry it took me so long to see. I stood in silence, processing the symmetry of this moment, the way it mirrored and inverted the worst night of my life. The same room, the same hands, but everything else transformed. I wanted to embrace him, to tell him all was forgiven, to pretend the past had not happened. But Margaret had taught me that kindness without boundaries was an invitation to be used, and I knew that forgiveness given too easily would mean nothing to either of us. Words are easy, son. I finally said, my voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm me. Actions take time, but this is a start. Evan nodded, accepting the measured response without complaint. He understood, perhaps for the first time, that rebuilding trust was not a single moment, but a long journey, one that would require consistent effort and demonstrated change. The applause he had offered was a symbol, meaningful, but not sufficient on its own. What mattered now was what came after. The same hands that once applauded my exile now applauded my return. The days following Evan's gesture of reconciliation brought decisions I had been avoiding for weeks. The house where I had spent 40 years, where Margaret and I had built our life and raised our son, stood empty now, waiting for me to determine its fate. Judith had made clear that as trustee, I had full authority to return and resume my life there as if nothing had happened. But standing in that living room where my son had applauded my exile, surrounded by gray walls and cold furniture that a predator had chosen, I knew I could not go back. Some places hold too many memories to serve as a fresh beginning. That house had too many ghosts. Instead, I chose a small cottage that became available 3 streets away from Rosemary's home, a modest 2-bedroom dwelling with a wraparound porch and a garden that had been neglected but showed promise. It was a quarter of the size of my former residence, with creaky floors and windows that stuck when the humidity rose. But it was mine in a way the old house could never be again, a space untainted by years of manipulation and disrespect, a place where I could begin the final chapter of my life on my own terms. The family home was sold within 2 months of listing, purchased by a young couple expecting their first child who saw past the unfortunate renovations to the solid bones beneath. Following the instructions Margaret had left in her trust documents, the proceeds from the sale were donated in their entirety to the Elder Protection Foundation, a charity she had supported quietly for the last decade of her life. I learned from Judith that Margaret had discovered the organization during her investigation into Lydia, when she was researching the resources available to elderly victims of financial exploitation. The donation was substantial enough to fund their programs for years, helping countless seniors avoid the fate that Margaret had worked so hard to spare me from. Evan came to visit me on the first Sunday after I moved into the cottage, arriving with a potted plant he had chosen himself and an awkwardness that made him seem younger than his 45 years. We sat on the porch, drinking coffee, searching for words that did not come easily after so many years of distance and silence. The conversation faltered and restarted multiple times, touching on safe topics like the weather and the garden, before retreating into uncomfortable pauses. But he came back the following Sunday, and the Sunday after that, and gradually the silences grew shorter, and the words came more freely. We didn't speak of Lydia, Her name had become a wound neither of us was ready to probe, a shared shame that would require more healing before it could be examined directly. Instead, we talked about Margaret sharing memories of her that had been suppressed during the years when mentioning her name seemed to irritate Evan's wife. We talked about Evan's childhood, the camping trips and baseball games and quiet evenings, reading together that had formed the foundation of who he was before Lydia began reshaping him into someone else. We talked about the future, tentatively at first, then with growing hope as we discovered that the bond between father and son, though damaged, had not been entirely destroyed. On a cool morning in early autumn, I drove to the cemetery where Margaret was buried and knelt beside her grave with fresh flowers in my hands. The headstone bore her name and the dates that marked the boundaries of her time on earth, but it said nothing of the woman she had truly been, the fierce protector who had spent her final years preparing for a battle she knew she would not live to fight. I placed the flowers against the stone and took her letter from my pocket, reading the words I had now memorized but still needed to see in her handwriting. "You were right about everything," I whispered to the quiet air. "You saw what I refused to see, and you protected me even when you were gone. I don't know how to thank you for that. I don't know if there are words big enough." I folded the letter carefully and returned it to my pocket where it had lived since the day I first discovered it. "I'll try to live in a way that honors what you did. I'll try to be the man you always believed I could be." The weeks that followed brought a lightness I had not felt in years, perhaps in decades. I started working on the cottage garden, clearing away weeds and planting flowers that would bloom in the spring. I joined a book club at the local library, meeting every other Thursday with a group of retirees who shared my love of historical fiction and spirited debate. I spent long afternoons on Rosemary's porch drinking tea and laughing at stories from her youth that she had never shared before, building a friendship that had existed in Margaret's shadow but now flourished in its own right. For the first time since Margaret's death, I felt genuinely happy. Not the desperate happiness of someone trying to convince themselves that everything was fine, but the quiet contentment of a man who had weathered a storm and found solid ground on the other side. The anger I had carried toward Lydia faded into something more like pity, a recognition that she would spend her life repeating the same destructive patterns until they consumed her entirely. The grief I had felt over Evan's betrayal transformed into cautious hope as our Sunday visits became something both of us looked forward to rather than endured. I was 69 years old, living alone in a small cottage with a neglected garden and creaky floors, and I had never been more at peace with myself and my place in the world. Freedom felt quieter than expected, but it was finally mine. 6 months passed like water, finding its natural course each day, flowing into the next with a rhythm I had almost forgotten was possible. The cottage that had seemed so small when I first moved in now felt exactly right, its modest rooms filled with the simple pleasures I had neglected during the years of tension and silence that had defined my life under Lydia's shadow. Morning coffee on the porch became a sacred ritual, the steam rising from my cup as I watched the neighborhood wake around me. The vegetable garden I had planted in early spring now yielded tomatoes and peppers and herbs that I used in dinners I cooked for myself with a satisfaction I had never known before. Rosemary came for dinner every Wednesday evening, bringing desserts she had baked and stories she had remembered since our last visit. Our friendship, which had existed for decades in the background of our lives, now occupied center stage. We talked about Margaret, constantly sharing memories that made us laugh and cry in equal measure, keeping her alive in the space between us through the simple act of speaking her name. Rosemary had become more than a neighbor, more than the witness Margaret had enlisted in her secret campaign to protect me. She had become family in the truest sense of the word, chosen rather than inherited, valued for who she was rather than what she could provide. Evan's visits continued every Sunday without fail, though the awkwardness of those early conversations had gradually given way to something warmer and more genuine. He had started seeing a therapist shortly after the divorce was finalized, working through years of suppressed emotions and examining the patterns that had made him vulnerable to someone like Lydia. The changes were visible in the way he carried himself, standing straighter, speaking more directly, meeting my eyes without the flinching guilt that had characterized our interactions for so long. On a Sunday in late summer, Evan arrived at the cottage carrying a bouquet of white lilies, Margaret's favorite flower. "I went to see Mom this morning," he said as he settled into the chair across from mine. "I brought her flowers and sat there for almost an hour just talking to her, telling her things I should have said while she was alive." His voice caught slightly, and I saw the moisture gathering in his eyes. "I'm learning to be the man you raised me to be, Dad. It's taking longer than it should have, but I'm learning." I reached across the space between us and placed my hand on his arm, a gesture of connection that would have been impossible a year earlier. "Your mother would be proud of you," I said. "She always believed you would find your way back. That's why she did what she did, prepared what she prepared. Not because she had given up on you, but because she knew you would need protection until you were strong enough to protect yourself." We did not speak of Lydia. Her name had become irrelevant, a footnote in a story that had moved beyond her capacity to influence. Rumors drifted through the community from time to time suggesting she had relocated to another state, perhaps seeking new opportunities among people who did not know her history. But these reports held no interest for me. Whatever Lydia did with the rest of her life, whatever victims she found or failed to find, was no longer my concern. She had faded from our lives like a bad dream upon waking, leaving behind only the lessons her cruelty had taught us. The evening of that Sunday visit, after Evan had driven home and Rosemary had returned to her own cottage, I sat alone on my porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. In my hands I held a photograph of Margaret taken on our 30th wedding anniversary, when her hair was still dark and her eyes still sparkled with the mischief I had fallen in love with so many decades before. The frame was worn from handling the glass, smudged with fingerprints I never bothered to clean because they felt like proof of connection, evidence that I still reached for her, even though she was gone. "You were right about everything," I said softly to the photograph, to the memory, to whatever part of her might still be listening from wherever souls go when they leave us. "You saw what I refused to see. You prepared for battles I didn't know were coming. You protected me from beyond the grave with a thoroughness that still takes my breath away." I traced the outline of her face with my finger, feeling the cool glass beneath my touch. I spent so many years believing that kindness meant accepting whatever treatment others chose to give me. I thought love required endless sacrifice, boundless tolerance, the erasure of my own needs in service of keeping peace. But you knew better. You always knew better. The sun dipped lower, its light softening into the gentle glow of approaching dusk. Somewhere in the distance, a bird sang its evening song, and the smell of the flowers I had planted drifted across the porch on a warm breeze. "Kindness without boundaries is an invitation to be used." I continued speaking the words Margaret had written in her letter, the words that had become my guiding principle through everything that followed. But kindness with boundaries, that's something different entirely. That's strength, that's wisdom, that's love that protects itself so it can continue to give. I pressed the photograph against my chest, holding her close one more time. "Thank you, my love, for seeing me clearly, for loving me fiercely, for arming me against enemies I was too blind to recognize. I will carry your lessons with me for whatever time I have left, and I will try every day to be worthy of what you did." The sky darkened slowly around me as I sat in the peaceful silence of my small cottage, surrounded by the garden I had planted and the life I had rebuilt from the ruins of betrayal. I was 69 years old, a retired postal worker with a complicated past and a son who was learning to be better. I was a widower who still talked to his wife's photograph, and a neighbor who had found unexpected friendship in his final years. I was a man who had been thrown out of his own home and had discovered in the aftermath that home was not a building, but a state of being. One day you may understand your parents not when they speak, but when they stop. And if you are lucky, they will have left you a letter explaining why. And that is the story of Franklin Ward, a man who learned that the people closest to us can sometimes cause the deepest wounds. What strikes me most about this story is how Margaret saw the truth long before anyone else did. She spent her final years not in peaceful rest, but in quiet preparation, building walls to protect the man she loved from a threat he refused to see. That is what real love looks like. It does not just say sweet words. It takes action, even when no one is watching, even when you will not be there to see the results. If there is one lesson I hope you take from this story, it is this: kindness without boundaries is not kindness at all. It is permission. Permission for others to use you, to take from you, to treat you as less than you deserve. You can be generous and still say no. You can be loving and still protect yourself. You can be forgiving and still remember who showed you their true face. To the sons and daughters listening, do not wait until your parents are gone to appreciate what they sacrificed for you. Stand up for them now while they can still see it. And to anyone who recognizes a Lydia in their own life, Trust your instincts. Document everything. Find people who will witness the truth. You are not paranoid. You are paying attention. Thank you for staying until the end. If this story moved you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. I will see you in the next video. Until then, remember, the truth does not need to shout. It only needs witnesses.